and stored for posterity. So make them as good as possible. Yeah, I'm very pleased on behalf of the Social Market Foundation to chair today's panel discussing labour and growth. And I'm very grateful to Blackstone for sponsoring this event as well. In some ways, I kind of think of growth as a Tory issue in the sense of, I'm used to, I've been to conservative conferences, and conservative conferences, they talk about growth. It's all about the head, not the heart. You come to Labour conferences, to the extent that you talk about the economy, it's about what do you tax and where we're going to spend the money. But the idea of growth has not been as central in Labour's thinking as it is today. And earlier today, Rachel, we said everything depends on growth. It was very clear that everything that Labour wants to do is contingent on getting success on growth. So growth is clearly a crucial issue, and we have a panel here that is expert in helping us to find the answers to how is Labour going to get growth. On my right is Chris Curtis, a part of the new intake of 2024 MPs, and he is in the Labour Growth Group. Is that right? That's Labour Growth Group. And is also chair of the YIMBY group, is that right?
Yeah.
So
I don't think we have official titles like that.
Oh, it's okay,
No,
but it is the YIMBY group.
There is a YIMBY group, yeah.
So right in the vanguard of Labour's new approach to growth and determination to get growth. And on my left is Kitty Ussher, who's a former finance minister, has previously been in a Labour government when it's been in a difficult financial straits, and knows how challenging it is to come through that cycle, and is also a member of the Times Shadow Monetary Policy Committee, and is currently at Barclays, where she's group head of policy development. So a lot of expertise. And then Andrew will be joining us shortly. But perhaps I'll start with that sort of general question of why is growth a Labour issue? First of all, I've just realised I need to give an intro to the podcast series that we've done. So we're just going to give you a little advert. I'm reminded because Paul Richard is sitting down here trying to get the laptop to work. So we, as well as, before we just get into the panel, sorry, I've done this at the back to front. But we just wanted to give you a trail of some of the podcasts that we've been doing with ministers, Secretary of State, just to explore this issue of growth. So, Richard, you want to see if we can make it?
And your critics would say that an employment rights bill is going to do the opposite of driving growth.
Right. So
tell me how that
works. Address that directly, because
and then we'll come back to that.
Because people say it will be challenging for growth because they think fewer people will be employed or what have you.
Well, it's harder to fire than companies will be slower to hire.
Yeah, I don't entirely buy it, because I think one of the problems that we've got at the bottom end of the labour market is people circling in and out of poor quality work. And one of the big questions that we've got, particularly if you look at the changing role of technology in the economy, is how do we use technology to design out some unsatisfying forms of work and help people have more satisfying forms of work where they're able to use a higher level of skill and have more consistent employment that's likely to lead to better paid employment in the future. And one reason why you might want to do that is because people having poor work is quite a strong driver of poverty. And another reason why you might want to do that is because that will increase productivity. And both are good for the economy. So I don't think the trade-off is quite as people describe it.
I think we've got one more clip as well.
Oh, yeah.
And you're critical are seeing these new ways of working within Whitehall. I think the next stage for me and the health and care mission for government, I think applies more broadly, is to take that same mission-driven philosophy and say, okay, well, great that we've got more cross-government working. Now we've got to mobilise the country, because just as we can't solve these big challenges without the state can't do this alone. So how do we mobilise business? How do we mobilise civil society and our voluntary sector? And how do we mobilise all of us as citizens to fulfil these really big missions and challenges? And people are up for it. And I think for this department in particular, in relation to business, and the work we need to do either with employers on occupational health or with life sciences and medtech in particular, there is just a cultural sniffiness in this department and in the NHS about the private sector. And we've got to break that down, because I don't just want to see the NHS benefiting from breakthroughs in life sciences and medical technology. I want to see the NHS actively driving those breakthroughs and being a catalyst for groundbreaking science, new drug discovery, new medical technologies, smarter use of data. I want us to kind of set the world standard on this.
So two different examples of ministers talking about growth. In some ways, I felt that Ali sort of more traditional in the Labour perspective of sort of the employment rights, but is that going to be a barrier to growth? But I thought she made a good case on how that will help improve productivity. And then where's perhaps sort of in a way that Labour hasn't in a number of years, making the case for the importance of the role of the private sector in the delivery of public services and the role that that can play in growth. So, but both health and employment are very focused on growth. And in the series that we're doing, I think all of the ministers in government see this agenda of growth as absolutely the prime mission. So that's my way of brief advert for our podcast that's coming up. But let me come back to the question I had in our panel, and apologies for the brief diversion. But how do you see this challenge of growth? Why is growth the Labour mission?
Well, I'll start by saying it's and I think you're right, but it's odd that it's considered a Conservative issue in the first place. I mean, you just look back through history, we've almost always had higher and more sustained economic growth under Labour governments and under Conservative governments. And that was true before, but my God, it's certainly true now. We've had 14 years of Tory governments that have provided some of the most anemic growth we've seen in modern British history. And the reason why, regardless of, Labour is better at creating economic growth for the country than the Conservatives. I think we've just got into a culture thinking otherwise, because we just sort of assume that because Labour's also good at public services, they must not be good at the economy. But actually, it's not true often, as Ali was making the case for. Achieving these things can also be good for achieving economic growth as well. So, I think it's a clear Labour issue. But regardless of the politics of it, it's really bloody important. And I'm often spend a lot of time being quite envious of my predecessors. And previously, you had Labour government taking over in 1997, where public services were pretty broken, but the finances of the country were in an all right place. You had a Tory government taking over in 2010, where public services were running pretty well. The NHS had high satisfaction ratings ever, but because of the financial crash, the finances of the country weren't in a great place. We've now taken over, and we've got public services that are in a worse place than 97, and we've got the finances of the country being in a worse place than 2010. Now, among other things, one of the reasons for that is that the Tories have failed to get any significant economic growth in the country for 14 years. And if they had, we would have a lot more money to go into our National Health Service, and we'd probably be paying late taxes at the same time. So it's just the most important issue in order to achieve literally anything that we want to achieve as a country. And just one other point on it being a Labour issue. What was the most significant sort of group of backbench Conservative MPs in Parliament under the last government? It was the ERG, trying to make sure that we had the most disastrous and chaotic leaving of the European Union that we possibly could. I'd say probably at the moment, the most significant grouping of us being formed in Parliament on the backbenches of this Labour government is the LGG. It's the Labour Growth Group, trying to work out how we can push for more economic growth, and doing papers and trying to understand that and pushing the government to go further where we think and believe that they need to go further. And I'll just make some brief points now, or do you want me to come back to it later?
Well, maybe I just ask you, you make the comparison of the ERG with the LGG, if that's what it's called. If the LGG is serious about growth, should Europe be an issue that you're campaigning for?
Well, I mean, we're going to have a better relationship with the European Union, and the exact specification of what that looks like will develop, I'm sure, over the coming years. But starting from a position of let's try and have this disastrous, chaotic leaving of the European Union is bad, going, this is an important trading partner of the UK, the country's voted to leave, they've made that perfectly clear, we have to respect that decision, but how do we make sure Brexit works for the economy? Starting from that position will inevitably lead to better possible outcomes, and alongside the many other things that we want to do on economic growth, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the next hour.
Let's come back to that, and then I'll bring Kitty in. So, you heard Rachel Reeves today. You've got a sense of where the government is going. So first of all, I guess my question is where the country is she right that we're in a much worse position than we were when Labour last left office, and particularly the last financial crisis? And then secondly, is what she's proposing, is it enough to get the growth that she expects?
Just some small questions.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, Theo, and nice to see everyone. Is it in as bad a position as she says? And yes, Chris is right, the stock of public debt is as high as it's ever been. It's very dramatic to say the stock of debt is the same as the size of the economy. There's no sort of mathematical kind of importance to that. It's just a sort of truism. 100% of GDP is the stock of debt. So that's higher than it was in 2010. And significantly higher than it was in '97, where I think it was around 40. 40 was the ceiling, wasn't it? So it was below that. In terms of there's lots of different ways of talking about the economy. In terms of the cyclical position, it's not actually that bad at the moment, in that since the beginning of the year, the growth forecasts have, as economists say, surprised on the upside, i.e. been better than people thought they would be. The stock market recovered really strongly at the beginning of the year after a bit of a recession at the end of last year. Obviously, inflation's now back on target, but we've got the sort of scars of it having been so high, peaking around 12%. It's expected that although we've had a bit of a sort of flat summer, that growth will pick up a little. So, I mean, it could be much worse. Interest rates now sort of beginning to come down as well as all of this normalises. The difficulty, and Rachel is absolutely right about this, is that the spending plans that this government inherited were not properly costed. And it seems to be that the root cause of this is that the previous government didn't do the 3-yearly spending review that they should have done, which meant that the forecasts for this year were just simply wrong because they hadn't taken account of how things had changed.
And do you go along with quite how wrong she says they are? Do you think 22 billion is a fair?
Well, I've read the papers that she published. She has made some decisions that means that's already now at 16 billion, not 22, and these are the contentious issues that she's already announced. And the fact that the Office of Budget Responsibility immediately initiated a review to look at what information they were getting from the Treasury does seem to imply that they were getting the wrong information from the Treasury, and action's been taken to get those spending reviews now done every 2 years for a 3-year horizon. So that should fix that problem in future. So I think we are in difficulty. It is also the case that growth fixes all this. And that if I could pick out a few things from Rachel's speech that I thought were really sort of pertinent to your point about maybe is this a Labour issue. She said that if our growth rates had been the same as the OECD average, then we'd have a whole billion, millions, or was it tens of billions more? I can't remember the exact number.
Just before we get, I was literally trying to frantically work out what the number was so I could say it. So
right, okay,
I couldn't find it either quite quick enough.
That number is significant.
A big number.
It's bigger than 22. I remember that. So that makes the point, very clearly that obviously you get more tax revenues in. But a line that I particularly liked was, and obviously it was appealing to the particular audience in the hall, was that the trade union movement had done more for industrial policy and growth and jobs than the Conservative government had by advocating for their sectors. And I think that was a lovely way of sort of really making the point that if you're in favour of growth and jobs, that's a Labour issue. It's at the core of our movement to do that, even when those jobs are in the private sector. There's another really important sort of change of language. I remember because I'm of that political generation, when Gordon Brown started using phrases like economic prosperity and social justice go hand in hand, they aren't in opposition to each other, triangulating that. And I think that's the same point about you have to increase prosperity in order to be able to spend money on public services. But the rhetoric's actually tightened since then. And if you listen to both what Rachel and Jonathan Reynolds was saying this morning, they kept using the phrase pro-business and pro-worker, pro-business and pro-worker. So the word business is now being completely rehabilitated, I would say, within Labour, because it's right, and B, it has to be private sector investment that drives growth. And if you could permit me sort of one more point, I'd like to elaborate on that slightly. So without wanting to sort of patronise people who have done GCSE economics, on a kind of annual basis, you only get, there's a sort of arithmetic kind of way of working out where growth comes from. You've either got consumers spending more, or you've got government spending more. Our consumers are feeling leery in the cost of living crisis and worried in the last few months in particular. Government's got no money, or you're going to have a massive increase in exports. And even then it doesn't have a huge effect on growth because you've got imports as well, and that's not happening. So the only thing that's actually left is businesses deciding to invest more, and that in itself is really, really volatile. So it is simply kind of arithmetically true that the only way to increase GDP growth is to get businesses to take the brakes off where they've been feeling hesitant since 2016. I don't need to tell you what happened in 2016. And if you look at the long term, growth since the Industrial Revolution has kind of, it goes ups and down, but basically it goes up. Business investment basically goes up. And in 2016, business investment flattened, it stopped. So that means, companies, big and small, sole traders, multinationals, everyone started basically saying, okay, I know what I need to do to invest for growth, but now's not the right time. Now's not the right time. We haven't got a Brexit deal. We haven't got this. We haven't got that. We've got instability. We've got a minority government. We've got a pandemic. We've got craziness. We've got electoral instability. And all of these things meant that it just hasn't started again. And so that's a sort of very simple imperative that this new government has had to do, is to say, actually, you know what? It's okay now. We can go back to normal. And so the normal sort of private sector investing for growth, hopefully, will start again. That's what they were trying to do.
What's the metric for success on growth? Is it just down to adding some more percentage points, however small, to GDP? Is it going above expectation of where GDP growth is expected to be? Or is it jobs? Is it tackling cost of living? Do you think what because we're focused on this mission? What is the measurement? Is it just GDP?
Well, I'd say the GDP is ultimately important, if only because not only, but if only because it dictates how much money we've got for our public services, right? Effectively, and they're in a real state. So we need to make sure that we do that. Just sort of coming up with a hierarchy of metrics on something like this is always particularly difficult, but ultimately we also need to care about the median wage, right? Where we're falling further and further behind both our European neighbours and particularly the US, despite the fact that not that long ago we were competitive with all of them in terms of median wage. And actually, electorally, that's really important, because whether that median person in the country is feeling like they're getting better off or not is the biggest thing that correlates with our chances of being re-elected next time round, and also how happy and comfortable they feel in their lives and are able to do what they want. So I think that's important. And look, we also have to care about inequality, which is too high. The amount that you do care about that is important, but I do think that we need to think about it, both in terms of individuals, but also in terms of regions. So we also need to make sure that all of these metrics are improving right across the country, and we're not leaving places behind, as has happened in previous periods of economic growth. And I think on that last point as well, it's important because not just because it means that we're bringing everyone along with us, but also because I believe that if we build economic growth off the back of if we build it more equally, it's more likely to be more sustainable. It's more likely to be more lasting, and it's less likely to lead to sort of the big severe downturns that have previously followed sustained periods of economic growth.
But then that sounds like it's not just growth. Actually, it's that sort of idea of everywhere, everyone, that feels like quite a different goal than just growth. You know, and in some ways, I feel like the last Labour government was sort of more. It was willing to let the city grow and then let the southeast grow in effect, and then tax that to spend and achieve the sort of redistribution goals. But this approach seems to be more about everyone everywhere, which is slightly different. Is that a fair description, or is that an unfair characterization of then and now?
I don't think it's one or the other. I mean, I don't think you dampen the city if you start focusing on what Rachel would call the everyday economy as well. And in terms of targets, they've set out a target that the economist in me thinks, oh good, that's an excellent idea, i.e. the highest sustained rate of growth in the G7. And the economist and the politician in me is completely terrified, because that is such a big lift, basically. As soon as I heard it, I thought, oh my goodness, is this like moonshot, or do they know what they're talking about?
We got to the moon.
Yeah, we got to the moon, and yeah, great, that's all right then. So, but I mean, let's go for it. But that's a GDP target. But I think what you hear in this rhetoric, and what I think most people in this room would feel very comfortable with, is the idea that there shouldn't be anything blocking anyone from being able to progress and grow. And sometimes it will need state intervention, but it shouldn't be place specific or community specific. It's about working out structurally what is blocking, what's making people feel stuck when they could be doing more. And obviously, if you focus on what drives productivity, which is only one way of thinking about growth, but it will be the more sustainable way of thinking about growth, and it will also link more closely to wages. So that's where it comes back to investment and infrastructure and skills as well.
I think you're right that the highest GDP growth in the G7, it's such a black and white target. It's a hostage to fortunes. But on the other hand, there's no time limit to it, so you could just achieve it once in the space of 5 years.
I think they said sustained by the end of the Parliament, but sustained by the end. So it's straightforward.
I mean that's
hopefully I got really bad everywhere else.
Yeah.
Sorry, camera.
Okay, well, I'm going to come to the audience for questions, but I'm going to ask one last tough question before I do, which is a question that I've often heard, and certainly heard at Lib Dem conference last week, and expect to get Tory conference next week, but which is what happens if Labour doesn't get growth? You know, what happens if actually we're in a, I mean, you see it around Europe, and you see it across the world. There are a lot of different democracies trying different ways to get growth, and almost all of them are struggling unless you have a super drug in your pharma industry, or you have extremely rare valuable minerals in the ground. It's very hard to magic growth at the moment. And so what happens if that's there? Is there a plan B? An even broader term, sort of, can Labour succeed without growth?
So, look, I'm on the optimistic side. I mean, I can't answer that question without starting by the point that it's like, I do think that we will reach a point of getting much higher sustained growth. And you speak to most people across business in the UK, and they're also reasoning. Yeah, I'm at my most pessimistic as a politician, have been for a while, when I speak to anybody who works in the public sector, because they say not only is it bad at the moment, but there are lots of pressures that are going to make it harder, and we're going to need more money. Right? You speak to anyone in the public sector, that's when I'm at my most pessimistic. I'm at my most optimistic when I speak to almost anyone in business across the country, from large to small, because actually what they say to me in one way or another is, we are desperate to invest in the UK. We're desperate to put in that business investment that Kitty was just talking about. And we've not been able to do so because of list of things associated with the last Conservative government that are actually pretty easy for us to fix. The planning system, not having 10 different chancellors and 14 different housing ministers over a few years, right? These are not difficult challenges. Making sure that we provide the business community with certainty, making sure that we're not shifting policy, making sure we're not going right up to the hill on a certain policy, make the entire business community plan for that, and then change our mind last minute. Just doing simple stuff like that is actually those kind of things that we can do that our Tory government, because they were more caring about playing politics than delivering economic growth, the kind of things we can do in order to start to achieve that again. So I really am on the optimistic side, and I think there's a lot of pent-up investment that is ready to go in the UK. And look, you know, you almost don't want to consider it, not just for political reasons, right? But actually just for the consequences for the country. If we don't achieve economic, we've got the highest taxes and we've got public services that don't work. If we don't get economic growth back quickly, we're going to have even higher taxes. I'm going to have public services that still don't work. The political, the economic, the social consequences of that really are quite severe. And that's why we need to make sure that we've got the political will, we've got the plan in place in order to bring that growth back. The conversations that we will be having if we don't will be about, well, has the NHS got a future? It will be, are we a country that will be able to respond to another pandemic in the way that we and support people in the way that we did with the last one? And the answers to that will be very uncomfortable. So God, it is really, really important that we do everything that we can to bring economic growth back to the country.
Yeah, I certainly like the sound of the optimistic Chris answer more than the less optimistic one. Kitty, do we need a plan B, and what should it be?
I find the idea of knowing what a plan B would be quite difficult, but because the stock of debt is so high. So I'm optimistic too, the same reasons as Chris said, and I've been working on the interface between the Labour Party and government and business for the whole of my career, on one side or the other, on both sides, and I've never seen a situation previously where a government completely understands how to create the stability that business needs. Labour went out to listen to business for partly political reasons, partly pragmatic reasons, and they properly listened and they heard, and they've created an entire political narrative around what is required to get investment, and I think it's sincerely meant. If something happens outside this government's control, events, if the situation in the US is worse than it seems to be, for example, because we do tend to catch a cold from them, I think it's all right. But if it's worse, if some other crisis befalls us that we can't imagine now, I worry a lot about the need to have to borrow more. Now, we wouldn't be alone having to borrow more if it's an external event. But when you start getting up to 100, 120, 130% of GDP, interest rates for government debt rise and rise and rise, and it's already taking money out of public services to a deeply unacceptable degree. It's being paid on interest payments when it could be going into the NHS. So it's just going to make the problem harder and harder. If we keep our cool in that situation, then probably avoid a sort of moment like Liz Truss had, but it just means when the circumstances right themselves again, we'll be starting even further back. So by definition, you can't control the uncontrollable. So I don't know if that means you can create a plan B, but I can't see a magic money tree. So I think we've got absolutely no option but to pursue the way we've been set out at the moment.
I want to go to the audience for questions. Yep.
I'm curious about your optimism because I certainly wish they can deliver on it, but I guess investment is the big thing, as you quite rightly say. And I don't quite see the mechanism, and I work in private equity. I don't quite see the mechanism of how do you unleash public sector investment or even private sector investment. There's an interesting, I forget the comment, I think that's Mariana Mazzucato published this letter about fiscal rules and unleashing capital investment. These big capital projects take a long time. I don't kind of see the mechanism how they're going to do that. I don't see the mechanism in private investment. When you look at the US, with all the tech, they've grown twice as much as we had in the last 20 years. So, we can wish for it, but and I really wish it to come true, but what's the mechanism here? And I mean, just in your thoughts, what's the mechanism to kind of unleash public sector and private sector? I mean, I think talking about pension rules And again, it's a very complicated setup. Like investment, I kind of things about how do you unleash both public sector and private sector investment.
Yeah. Shall I go?
Go on, you go first.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. There's lots of different types of investment. I think at a headline level, confidence can mean that plans are enacted. So that's free, okay? And that will sort of start to move the graph upwards. I think foreign direct investment is really interesting. And you heard the message today about Britain is open for business. We've moved on from what I heard at a party conference 2 years ago, international investors saying Britain has a, quote, moron premium. Those are the actual words from an international company headquartered in the US who had to go to their capital investment committee to make the case for investing in their plant in the UK, and were just told, no, there's a moron premium, there's too much political risk, they're just making the wrong decisions all of the time. So just removing that hygiene factor will help a little. There is no shortage of international capital. The question is what would make it come to Britain? And then I think for infrastructure, there are things that government can do. Yes, they do take time, but you're hearing the rhetoric of it, unblock it, get those contracts specified correctly so that the risk goes and long-term investments can start to come in. And then it gets too detailed for a conversation like this because it's different sector by sector, whether you're talking about ports or green hydrogen or grid connections or building houses or whatever. But each sort of imperative will have its own public-private sort of specification that will crowd that money in. And then you've got the pension fund issue, which I think is really interesting, but we should hear more about soon, about whether it is appropriate for governments that have consolidated pension pools to also start suggesting that perhaps they may go more into regional private markets, for example. I don't think that case has been won either way, but it's certainly there in the rhetoric, if not in the reality. But that, of course, presumes that there are millions of investable projects. My view, actually, that the problem is more on the demand side, that people actually aren't, companies aren't feeling brave enough to invest for growth, which can probably be unlocked a little. So I'm fairly optimistic that there's lots of things that can happen that haven't been happening that would help. But your point about timescales, I think, is very well made.
Good.
I think the planning reform piece is actually a really important part of this. And look, just because it's the way we talk about it publicly, it's all about houses and building more houses, and that's actually important for economic growth. But because we talk about that side of things publicly in the 1.5 million, well, I think we often miss is that actually a much improved planning system is really important for like building data centres. And when James Cameron, the bloody best film director, the living film director, the most successful one, wants to put a film studio somewhere near London, and he's told, no, you can't put it there because Buckinghamshire County Council is going to throw a strop, and we lose that massive, interesting investment in the country. That's clearly a problem, right? And that's a big missed out investment opportunity. So there is like pretty easy stuff actually that you can do on planning reform in order to not lose those amazing investment opportunities that really want to come to the UK. We also forget, like, we're pretty cool as a country. Like, we're the kind of place that people quite like and want to invest in. But we just made it too difficult quite often for people to do that. And I think planning system is a big part of that. And the chaos of government as well, as we were talking about before, is also inevitably a big part of that. So we can do those kind of things in order to start to unlock. I was going to make another point, but I forgot what it is, so I'll just come back to it.
Yeah, and on your point about pensions, I mean, there obviously is an enormous amount of money in the pensions that we all hold, and we know that there are large pension funds in other parts of the world, Australia, Canada, that famously invest large amounts of money, but they're not forced to do so by their governments. And if you are, if your job is to be responsible for your pension holders' money, you need to put it where it's going to get the best return on investment. And there's a sort of, normally the trade-off in British politics is where a voter is now and where they might be in 5 years. And too often the trade-off is where they are now is what gets favoured. But I feel like on the pensions thing, it's almost like the trade-off is between where will our pensions be in 40 years' time or 30 years' time, and where do you want the pension money to go over the next 5 to 10 years? And there is a sort of trade-off there that while it might be better in the 5 to 10 years to have that money going into the UK, it might be better in 30 or 40 years if they'd been investing that money in NVIDIA or in Vietnam rather than the UK, certainly in terms of the return to UK shareholders. But then I think the other risk is if you instruct, I think we haven't ruled out yet the idea of mandating investment in this area. I can't see Emma Reynolds going that far, but she hasn't ruled it out. But there are also risks in investing in the UK, and I think the pension funds all invested in Thames Water, and they're not too happy about that now. So I think investing in the UK is not a panacea. Even if we are successful in doing so, it may create problems for us down the line.
Yeah, and I just think it's a lot easier to make the UK more appealing as a place to invest rather than trying to fix the market to force certain pots to invest in, right? Yeah. And that first thing is not as hard as people make it out to be. There was one business I was talking to yesterday, I think about how I anonymise this, who was saying something along the lines of they get from their parent, an international parent company, they get a fixed amount given to them each year, and they are currently in order to build new stores. And they are giving somewhere in the region of a quarter of it back to their parent company each year because they come up with planning permission through in order to build those stores. That's hundreds of millions of pounds that we're losing as a country, and that is one company of thousands that are going through exactly the same situation.
A couple of extra points that I am sort of instinctively hesitant about mandating pension funds. However, there are some lessons from around the world that I think are relevant, which is if you're consolidating pension funds, so you've got big pool capital, each of those pools will be able to have asset management expertise that is greater than each one of them would have had in a fragmented way. And so you may be able to spot more opportunities, and the actual sum of money that ends up being invested in the UK within a totally competitive portfolio would be greater as a result of that. And also looking at, I certainly know about the Canadian model, there does seem to be a bit of a sort of natural home bias, because when you pay out the beneficiaries at the end, obviously there's currency risk if you've got that elsewhere. And so there do seem to be sort of arguments in favour of the home market. So I think it's quite interesting line of inquiry, but since we're only partway down the consolidation journey, both in DB and DC and in LGPS funds, it's quite a long way to go before that is sort of mature, before you need to think about something else. And because the other sort of little thing for completeness is at Barclays we did some work recently to estimate the amount of funds held by individuals, households, that even after keeping a really large emergency fund was still held in cash and it could potentially be invested. And that is hundreds of billions, we estimate £430 billion, that is available for retail investment. And then you're into some really interesting conversations about the advice guidance boundary review and what it is that's preventing people from putting a toe in that market in a sensible way that works for them, given the total massive amount of market failures of people not even knowing how to start and how to compare different options that I think the government could pursue. And maybe it's sensible to have, again, an internationally diversified retail holdings as well, but the British public may find it sort of closer to home if they invested locally through their own choice as well. So that's another potential source of funds.
Great. Question there, yeah.
Hello, my name is Michelle. I work at the Open University. I'd heard a reference to skills as one way in which to support the drivers of growth, but really keen to hear the panel's views more deeply on that. Be no surprise for you to hear that from an Open University perspective, we think that we really do need a culture change in terms of supporting and incentivising lifelong learning, regardless of age, regardless of level, background, etc. We do, this is more in the HE space and skills space, I appreciate, but the levers just aren't there to incentivise it. And that's incredibly frustrating, particularly for older, mature learners part-time study, etc. So really great to hear your thoughts on how we can try and unlock that one too. Thank you.
Just to be fair to the panel, we were going to have Andrew, and Andrew was going to be doing the skills agenda and the growth. So you're right to have spotted that it's missing.
I just scribbled it off my list to leave it for Andrew.
But I think you're right. I think it's critical. And if you think of the government is successful with the infrastructure and construction projects, there's 2.5 million new construction workers needed, and if they're successful on the tech and public sector and the tech and AI challenge, and again, there's millions of jobs around STEM that we need, and both at the early stage and in terms of career change, we need to be able to do all of those things. But it's a lot easier to say that you're going to do those things, and every government has promised those things, and then in practice, it's a lot harder to deliver. I mean, my brother-in-law is a welder in the oil and gas industry, and I know that he's sort of, every time I have a policy conversation with him, and he's pretty skeptical about the idea that he and all his colleagues are going to easily be retrained to work on renewables, and just can't see how that's going to happen for someone in their mid-50s.
I think it is important, and we need to do it, and we need to think about how we unlock it. I mean, in terms of like the biases that we've had in policy making that have caused us a lot of these problems, both on this front, and actually you talked a bit about the sectors that we need to support as well. I think it's important there is we've just been quite nostalgic as a country, and that's caused issues. It's caused issues in terms of the industries that we think about. I mean, we have some of the best creative industries in the world, probably the best, people making films and television, some of the best in the world. But it's a lot easier politically to support some of those industries that people sort of consider as kind of nostalgic British traditional industries, rather than putting all money into Channel 4, which is one of the reasons that we've got some of the best creative industries in the world. So you think it's important in like the sectors we think about and support. I think it's particularly true under the last government, but I think it's also true in skills as well. I think we can often be quite nostalgic in the way we think about skills to support. That's kind of been, I think, the problem with like the apprenticeship levy and the importance of pushing something that a very sort of fixed old model of apprenticeships. And I think that's the kind of shift that we want to get out of with the ways that we're going to be changing that levy, focusing much more on lifelong learning, thinking about the different skills, thinking about the skills of the future and everything else, which I hope can mean that we've got a far more sensible skills policy going forwards.
Yeah, I wouldn't call myself a world expert, but I do know the Open University is wonderful. And,
Yes.
I think you've got more students than any other institution, am I right in saying? And I've been a student of the Open University as well, needing to brush up some of my maths skills about 10 years ago. So thank you to the Open University for helping me do some stats modules there. I know that there's some quite ambitious lifelong learning proposals that are in train by the last government, so it'd be interesting to see what happens there and whether university courses are sort of distributed in a different way, both in terms of access and over time. The thing I think is really interesting about this is those people who are totally stuck, because not as well as being kind of cash poor, they're also time poor. So, because the Open University is there for people who have some time to do it in their own way. And the image I often have in my mind is, say, someone who's got loads of young kids and so is working around the school run and has got this poverty trap from the cost of childcare and is perfectly capable and would clearly double their salary if instead of working locally they were, say, an accountant, but haven't got the way to do that, not difficult training if you're capable, might take a while if they're time poor as well as cash poor. I think the Open University is quite sort of well placed to kind of start unpicking that, and who pays for that, I think, is a really interesting question. And increasingly, I think that some of the sort of routes to unlocking growth is actually about thinking, well, who's stuck, who can't progress? Is it because of locational circumstance or whatever? And how do we create that path? So I do think there's a lifelong learning part in there that's really important.
Given the Open University is based in Milton Keynes, I'm normally the one on the panel that has to do the pitch for why the Open University is fantastic. So thank you for picking that up for me.
One question there and one here.
Martin Turner from MEF Limited. Is there a case that we're underplaying the upside here? I'm thinking in 3 to 6 months' time, there could be a civil war in the US. We've got a land war in Europe, China, Taiwan. If the UK looked like a beacon of stability to unlock the confidence in.
Oh, it's a good point.
That's
Yeah.
the upside.
Secondly, if you look at the forecast for the mainstream energy forecast, the International Energy Agency, they've always been pessimistic on falls in the cost of solar, wind and battery. So we could be heading for net zero energy costs within a decade, and the best case scenario. Every time we have an energy cost revolution, you have an industrial revolution, which is a kind of growth optimistic moment. So is there a chance that we're in this current gloomy environment, we're underplaying the upside?
And question here.
I was just going to extend the agony of not having Andrew, sorry. I'm also from education skills, sort of, my organisation is called Independent Higher Education. We have a certain sort of interconnection of skills and higher education. Our members are a mixture of charities and British founded private companies and internationally invested companies as well. And we're really, I think it's a little bit uncertain about the lifelong learning entitlement. There's some very lukewarm words in relation to committing to that and moving forward. But I think it's really important. I mean, OU do a great job in terms of access to degree level provision, but a lot of the industries, growth industries, including the trade industries, and they often need sort of shorter courses. They often need more practical and skills-based courses with maybe higher knowledge, sort of the higher training elements. But I think, I guess what I'm sorry, question out here, but it's very complicated how you connect the education offer, skills offer, with the industries which will need those skills, with the locations where different might be based, with the planning. It's all very interconnected. How you guys will get on top of that? Obviously, the strategy would be great, but need to hear how you think it's going to happen with the interconnection.
Okay, so two questions there. I think one is sort of about sort of how does the government do that connection, the industrial strategy of skills and businesses, and that feels like a government role to me. And then this other question, which is, I think in two parts really. One is sort of how optimistic are we about the external sort of outside the UK factors and what impact they could have on the UK. It does seem like that's quite significant. And then could we be significantly underestimating? Are we not being optimistic enough? So who wants to take? You want to take the strategy one?
Well, just on that one, I'm probably I've got lots of colleagues in the Labour Party that are much more sort of devolution optimistic than I am. But one place I'm very optimistic is the devolution of skills and what we can do there. And you're devolving it to authorities, or hopefully combined authorities, that also have all of those other powers that you're talking about. And I hope in the coming years, with a growing economy, we can give them the capacity to do much more strategic thinking and work in order to join those things up. And I chat to my local council, will hopefully end up in a combined authority soon. And that's where they all get very excited and they all do lots of thinking about, we're potentially having there's proposals in place to put a massive theme park in what will be our combined authority with 8,000 new jobs. How do we link that up with the 3 colleges in the area and make sure that we're skilling people in order to create that workforce? And then also, how are we building the houses that those people can live in so they're not moving elsewhere when they've got those skills? How are we making sure that they can get from Milton Keynes and Luton to Bedford on the transport? So yes, I think it's really interesting actually when we start to devolve those skills panels down to local councils, the kind of strategic thinking that we can do on that front. I've made the case that I'm sort of broadly optimistic. I would prefer your second argument to be true than your first argument, because while it would be, I can see a case that we do become a much more appealing place to invest in internationally in the coming years, and that's a great upside. The downside, which is the amount of GDP that we're going to have to find for defence spending, more than outweighs the positives in that situation. So I'm not so optimistic about that, but I do think that on lots of these things, there's lots of maths and calculations that we're doing at the moment where you can see a lot more space for the outcome to be on the more optimistic side of what the model's currently spitting out than on the pessimistic side.
Can I talk to the geopolitical one?
Yeah, so I'm wondering whether you've just articulated the plan B, which is everyone else collapses, and then I'm not sure we'd want that in anyone. I do think that some of the Britain is looking a less politically risky place, obviously, because we have a change of government, but also political risk is increasing in some of our neighbours, just a fraction if you look at the setup in Germany and France, for example, just at the margins, maybe Britain is looking a little better. I think, unfortunately, the experience of the last few years has shown that massive geopolitical events make everybody sort of freeze, and because we're a very open economy, they probably have a negative effect on us too. So I certainly do agree that the faster we transition to net zero, obviously the less dependent we are on potentially more unstable parts of the world, as we are seeing recently.
Yeah, I think there is going to be a more difficult trading. I think trade is going to get more difficult and more political, even more than it is today. And geopolitics is such a big issue for investment already. But I think key to that is the UK having independence of thought when it comes to making those decisions. I think it's been very interesting to see a decision early on with this government on that issue of geopolitical trade around the tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, where Europe has put a big tariff on it. The US is trying to stop it altogether. Now, there is a case for saying this is a defense issue. Why would you want Chinese cars that, in the event of conflict between the West and China, you've made yourself dependent on something that could be critical. And there's also an economic case. China has subsidized this industry. Why would you flood the market with this? But there is clearly also a case of being able to calculate what you believe is in your national interest at that point. And if we want to accelerate to net zero, we can get a bunch of cheap EVs while also continuing to have our own EV market, then I think the government has made that decision in that way. I think another example of that independence of thought would be around the IPO of Shein, the big clothing online retailer with Chinese origins, which the US won't let them go to IPO, and the UK look like, well, it's still going through the process, but it's quite possible they would IPO here. I think that would show an independence of thought from the US. And I think you get into all of those geopolitical complexities, but what I think it does show that is, I think the countries that are succeeding around the world in this sort of navigation, we talk about after Brexit being Singapore on Thames. Well, what Singapore does very well is navigate these geopolitical challenges in a very careful, cautious, but entirely self-interested and independent way. I think after, given that we're no longer part of the EU, that's the task, and that's one of the ways towards growth. I think we have time for one last question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Susie. I'm from the Canal and River Trust, and we look after 2,000 miles of essentially 250-year-old infrastructure, plus a lot that goes with it, 82 reservoirs and things like that. When I hear the government talking about growth and drivers of growth and stuff in connection with infrastructure, it always seems to be about shiny new things. And I'm wondering what the appetite is for reinvesting in shiny old things, but not very shiny old things, but old things that can be repurposed to deliver growth, rather than sort of try something new. And what would be the way in to try and convince the government, I suppose, that is a very valid thing to do and very productive, even though it looks old and heritagey.
Yeah, well, they were the superhighways of the future at one point.
Well, until the trains came and overtook them, but yes.
Yeah, and I think if we were in Birmingham, we'd see sort of that regeneration of the canals there. It's been absolutely
so many canals in Birmingham, we actually have a roundabout.
Yeah.
Really?
That's amazing.
Thoughts?
I hadn't given much thought to how we can invest in the canals and rivers in order to create more economic growth, but we've got a fantastic canal running through Milton, Keynes, which I believe you manage, and it creates a lot of happiness and for people's lives, and there's a real anchor for a city. And I think it's great, and we should definitely continue to invest in these things.
Sorry, I've been a bit unkind with my question. There's water transfer, so we're doing water transfer so that dry parts of the country get water. There's regeneration, obviously, where we've got water and your bills, then that's a really important part of growth. There's green energy. There's a lot of things that we can do with it, which are not generally thought about when you think about the canal. So,
well, I think there's keenness in Milton Keynes on further investment in canals, from what I hear.
Well, what I mean, it's a slightly different answer to the question. What I spend a lot of time thinking about is one of the things that I think makes Milton Keynes fantastic as a new city is we have waterways running through the middle, and I think that's a really good way of doing new development. I think it's definitely a pattern that we should continue when we're doing hopefully more new towns in the coming decades or big urban extensions, and thinking about how we interact those with the waterways that are currently there and make sure that we're using them in order to build the infrastructure, just like we did with Milton Keynes. But I can't say I've given much thought to these arguments beyond that.
You want to? I'll have a go.
Yeah.
So as a former MP for Burnley, which has the Leeds Liverpool Canal going through it, I can immediately see the sort of heritage amenity sort of regeneration possibility, which I suspect is probably an issue for the local council on that sort of side of it, to bring developers together. I'm really intrigued by your broader infrastructure point. So, I mean, now is a really good time to make this case. It probably needs just a little bit of thought about if there was a private sector potential investor, how would a contract be structured so that they would get a rate of return for the upfront investment? And I don't know the industry well enough to know how that would be, how that would happen, but presumably, there is some economic rate of return from shifting water around the country. So that's probably the area to go into. I think the only thing I would say is now is a really, really good time to be thinking that through, because the government's got no money, so it's going to have to capture international capital in order to upgrade infrastructure that it needs, but proper infrastructure, network reasons. And so I will probably now spend far more time thinking about this than I would have done if you hadn't asked the question. So thank you.
We've talked about sites in our own constituency where this has been a success story, but actually probably the one down there that's the biggest one, right? The fantastic redevelopment of an old brownfield site and a Rivers and Canals Trust site to a certain extent, or it is now, which is great. Ended up hosting Eurovision and Labour Party conference. You can rate those two in the order that you think, but incredible economic growth into the area, and there are other similar sites where I'm sure across the country we can be doing that kind of thing as well. And also, I suppose it leads into the coolness of the UK, right? People like coming up here and seeing the Beatles Museum, and I'm sure it's crowded with a lot of private sector investment by doing that fantastic redevelopment work.
Great. Well, this has been a very wide-ranging discussion from Third World War to investment in canals. So thank you to the audience for your engagement and interesting questions. Thank you to our panel for a really thoughtful and insightful answers. Thank you to Blackstone for sponsoring the event and also the podcast. Do subscribe to the podcast when they come out later in the week. And thank you to all of you for coming.
Thanks, Theo.